Hello everyone, thanks for coming back. I'm going to talk again more about our soft fascist country, Canada. And I have done a little bit more research. I've done quite a lot of research, in fact, recently. A recently retired Prime Minister, his name is Jean Chretien. He had a great deal of trouble with the province of Quebec, which is where he's from. And he was in danger of losing an election. So he conspired with a man named Antonio Genet, and his last name is spelled G-E-N-E-S-T. He convinced Genet to run for the leadership of the Progressive Conservative Party, which was the party that he was running against. He was running as a liberal, but he couldn't win the riding. So he convinced his friend, Mr. Genet, to run, and he'd help him get elected. So he did, and the guy became the leader. In that riding, he ran against Jean Chrétien, but he didn't show up at any meetings. He agreed to act so inept and so stupid that nobody would vote for him. So what was the reward for Mr. Genet? At that time, Justin Trudeau was the Minister for Parks Canada. So Mr. Genet has a son who he can't seem to get employed anywhere. And so Mr. Chrétien gave him a job at Banff National Park, Alberta, which is like, it looks like Disneyland in the mountains. It is fabulously beautiful. I've been there many times. So Mr. Genet did his job. He made sure that he discredited himself. And later in his life, he was about 68 years old when he was being interviewed by a journalist. He said, "I admit to it, sure." He says, "In fact, I did it twice for Mr. Chrétien." He says, "But he has not rewarded me yet, and now is the time." He leaned forward. He's drinking beer in a pub. He leaned forward and he said, "But now would be the time to reward me." So Chrétien conspired to destroy democracy for fascism. Once you have taken out your opponent, he's done it many times. It is, in Quebec, it's considered, because Quebec has a different set of laws there. They have Napoleonic Code. And Napoleonic Code are the laws of a dictator. So it's inbred in them. It's Mr. Chrétien studied law in Quebec, and he studied Napoleonic Code. So under English common law, you can't do these things. But in Quebec, it's common. And when I was unemployed here in the province of British Columbia, Mr. Chrétien came forward. He was Prime Minister at that time. He keeps winning by subterfuge. He promised us $500 million and sent $500 million to British Columbia for retraining. It came here. I got involved with that. I decided I was going to now switch from the fishing industry, salmon, which was beautiful and still should be a vibrant industry. I was going to do computer work. It was all paid for by the government of Canada. My own office had $50 million. I got enrolled. The office spent $1,234. It's easy to remember. $1,234 on me. All I had to do was pass the course. It was called A+ certification through Microsoft. I made 96. I didn't just pass it. I was that interested in it so that I could make a reasonable living and enter the middle class, as Justin Trudeau says we all should be doing. So I trusted the Prime Minister of Canada. So what do you think happened to the money? All of the money disappeared. I went to the office many times. They claimed that I now had to get a student loan. I am unemployed. I can barely pay anything. I'm living in a rooming house. And Mr. Chrétien refused to make any answer. Nobody's answering me at Human Resources Development. I get passed on from office to office to office to office. So I get angry, and I go through the Law Referral Service, British Columbia. And they give me a very smart young lawyer. And I had a wonderful place to work. He's a member of the bar, of course. So I went to him with my problem. And he's listening very intently. He's making some notes. And he said, "Mr. Wheaton, I'm going to have to look into this." He said, we've been following this kind of activity from the federal government, and I'll see what I can do." So approximately a month later, his secretary called me to come and see him. So I do. We have a private meeting. If it's being recorded, I'm sure it was recorded actually, but he didn't give me anything in writing. But he smiled at me and he said, "You were getting awfully good value for your money." He said, "But the more I tried to find out from the federal government about what happened to the $500 million, the more they fought me." He says, "Even lied to me, and I'm a lawyer, and the government of Canada lied to me." So, he said, me and my fellow lawyers here decided we're not letting this drop. So we didn't. finally found out what happened to the 500 million, Mr. Wheaton. I said, well, what happened? He said the minister, Doug Young, ordered every penny sent back to Ottawa for general revenue. Not one penny that Mr. Chretien promised us and delivered ever came to British Columbia. I said, so what happened to the 500 million? He said, perhaps Mr. Young gave it to his friends, or the Prime Minister of Canada gave it to his friends. But as we now know in Canada, that 500 million went to a thing called the sponsorship scandal of Quebec. Every penny was dumped on Quebec, so it would not vote for separation from Canada. Jean Chretien made me pay a heavy, heavy price, and others like me. So I am responsible for Canada and Quebec kissing and making up. It is my future that they robbed from me and many others like me. Jean Chretien should be in prison. He conspired with Antonio Genet to destroy democracy in Quebec so that he could win the riding. Strangely enough, as ironic as it is, I am from New Brunswick. My home riding is called Beauséjour. Later on in Mr. Chrétien's life, he couldn't win. He had the leadership of the party, but he didn't have a seat, and he couldn't win in Quebec. He had welched on his deals. Mr. Genet was supposed to get rewarded, but he didn't get rewarded. He only rewarded his son. He gave him a job in Banff National Park. Now, this is a Quebecois man who may or may not be able to speak English, who is going to have a very nice job in Banff, and he probably cannot communicate very well, and perhaps hasn't the slightest idea how to run a park, which I would guess is true. But it was the only job Mr. Chrétien could give him, and it would be a very good paying job. And he's a Quebecois living in English Canada. It would be difficult for him. He probably transferred out and went to a park in Quebec later on. And that's where he would be more comfortable, just to be fair to the man. It would be more comfortable for him to be in Quebec rather than be in Banff Park. But that's where you start. And then in the federal government, you can, jump out. You can transfer laterally, they call it, and end up in Quebec. But Mr. Genet did not get rewarded. But Mr. Genet did it again for Mr. Chrétien, one more time. He says, it's just the way we do things in Quebec. Well, it is. It's Napoleonic code. It's fascist. It's a fascist regime. Fascism through and through. And the Elections Canada, who I'm about to write to, because I just discovered this through Canada Newsstand. I had no idea such a thing happened. I did not know these things. I was a young man at the time, and I was trying to make a living. I was trying to do all these things, and I was married and trying to keep the marriage together, which eventually fell apart. You don't need to know all those details. Everybody has their problems when you're a young person. However, after I've discovered this, I thought, I keep talking about fascism, but this is the destruction of democracy. This is what Mr. Chrétien did. And he became the Prime Minister of Canada. And when he became the Prime Minister of Canada, there was a premier here in this province. His name is Glenn Clark. And he had a little headbutt with the Pentagon of the United States. This is true. He canceled, because the Americans here sat in Nanoose Bay, but they owned the seabed. They leased it, They leased the seabed for testing torpedoes, and the torpedoes were made out of spent uranium. And spent uranium, if you're near it or contact with it, it will cause cancer, 100% of the time. The state of Oregon wouldn't allow the testing, the state of Washington wouldn't allow the testing, and certainly not the state of California. So where did they get? British Columbia, Canada. I don't know who ever made this initial agreement. However, Mr. Clark decided he's canceling it. They're not doing this anymore. They're not dumping their spent uranium on Canadian soil. But the Pentagon called in a favor to the President of the United States, who at that time was Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton called Jean Chrétien. Jean Chrétien, he loved Bill Clinton. But I tell you, the people of Quebec have a very strong affinity for Americans, in particular the state of Florida, where they have their own town, their own radio station, and their own newspapers. I can't blame them, though. Florida is pretty sweet. If you've ever been there, it's really nice. So, what does Chrétien do? He calls the RCMP, and he says, I need Glenn Clark removed from office. So the RCMP trump up a charge, because I guess somebody ratted him out, and they got a journalist on board. The journalist said he was just there by accident, which is not true, because in the middle of the night they raided Glenn Clark's house. But there wasn't a judge here in British Columbia who would sign the search order, wouldn't do it. But there is one federally appointed judge. And he was appointed, I would assume, by, I would like to know, I should try to find this out. I expect that it was Jean Chretien who appointed him. And as I now know, every province of Canada, the federal government appoints a judge in strategic places. And I thought later, I said, you know what that's for? That's to make the dirty deed done, and done dirt cheap, as AC/DC once wrote about. And it's true. It's not just true of Canada, but it's blatant here. So they find that there's a judge who's on vacation. He's in Palm Springs, California. So the Royal Canadian Mounted Police rent a Gulfstream G5 executive jet with all the bells and whistles. And they fly, a group of RCMP officers fly from Vancouver Airport to Palm Springs, California, and they find a judge on the golf course doing the Mully thing. Mulligan, Mully, Mully. Can't seem to get the ball in, so I could make a little comedy thing about that, but I'm not going to. So they interrupt his golf game. And they explain to him that there is an emergency in Canada, and he has to come back. Now, he was suspicious. He was suspicious. Well, where's everybody else? There's lots of judges in British Columbia. What do you need me for? It was a request of the Prime Minister of Canada. He requested it. Oh. And of course, you see, then you have this problem. A federally appointed judge who owes his living to the Prime Minister of Canada. So is there a little payback here? I'm just suggesting there probably was. I can't prove anything, of course, because if they shoot me dead, dead men don't get to talk. You ask any cop if that's true, and that's true. So they convince him to give up the golf game. They packed him up, put him on the G5, Gulfstream G5. Sweet ride, man. And, I'm sure they're partying it up a little bit. There was the RCMP are famous for this thing called the musical ride. They were probably doing a musical ride in the air. The mile club. Don't say that, Terry. Don't say that. I have two people here who work for me, by the way. I shouldn't say they work for me because they get angry when I say that. I have a cameraman. That's Felix. I have an audio woman, Cato. They both are trying to keep track of me and keep me on tracks here, so I'm trying to speak and watch their movements at the same time. They right now are sort of, I think they want more attention, but they're not getting it because I have to get back to this. So anyway, the judge comes back to British Columbia. He signed a search warrant. So they go to Glenn Clark's house, RCMP, and they brought a camera crew with them. The camera crew said they were there by accident, but that's not true. Obviously, they're lying because what happens in Canada, rewards are fantastic here. And journalists usually get rewarded with a seat in the Senate. And the seat in the Senate, you make fabulous money. And you get exemptions, and you get travel for free, and you get to work till you're 75 years of age, and you need to show up for 4 meetings a year. I believe they have 8 meetings a year. So you can show up, you got to show up for 4 of them, which takes 1 day. And then you're gone. So it's a great, great job. And every journalist in Canada wants it. And many, many journalists have done it. It's their reward, in my opinion. It's their reward. That's why you don't see anybody else talking the way I talk, because they're waiting for the reward. Anyway, I've already been robbed of everything that I could ever have, so that's where the government is. And that's what they do to people who ask too many questions. They destroy you, absolutely and completely. Sorry, my anger came out there. My crew is looking at me like, will you ever shut up about yourself? Okay, I'm going to shut up about myself. So what do you think happened? The RCMP claimed that he didn't have all of his receipts for a deck that was built on the outside of his house. And there was some allegation that the person that built that deck wanted to get a casino license or a bingo license or some gambling license or other. And of course it didn't happen. But the allegation was there. And of course it hits the newspapers. It's live at 5, camera crews. Here's the premier of the province. What's going on? RCMP are going through the house. They're going through their laundry. They're going through their underwear drawers. They're looking at all the videos they've got. They go through everything. They're meticulous, of course. Search warrant. Big deal. You know what I'd like to see in Canada? Because we have them here. I'm going to show you a picture of it later. We have a Hells Angels Motorcycle Club building. And I would like to see the RCMP show up at their door with a search warrant and go through it and see if they could actually enter the building. That would be fabulous to see. But I don't think they're ever going to do it. Even if a Prime Minister of Canada asked them to, they'd probably say, no, we're not doing that. So anyway, let me get back to Glenn Clark. Glenn Clark eventually had to resign. Jean Chrétien annexed Nanoose Bay and the seabed and gave it, at no cost, by the way, they don't pay for this, to the Pentagon in perpetuity. It will never be Canadian soil again. Never. So there was a little protest here in British Columbia. I'll get the details for you later. But a woman judge here said they got nothing. The RCMP should never have gotten the search warrant. Now, I've gone up against this judge myself, personally. And he's I don't know, he's really tight with some very big law firms here. Law firms here really like him because he generally has sided with them, and they make a lot of money. You know, the law thing is really about money. Not all lawyers are like this, but the Department of Justice certainly is, and they're rewarded with bonuses if they can destroy your ability to find justice. And that's happened to me. The woman named Elizabeth Wolfram is a very good example of that. I've gone up head to head with her twice. Anyway, she made sure I didn't find justice. But anyway, that's how we do it, and that's in Canada. That's Canada-wide now, because we've had so many prime ministers from Quebec, and they all know Napoleonic Code. They all know fascism. They don't know English common law. Pierre Elliott Trudeau used to do pirouettes behind the Queen. He hated anything English. When he said the word English, his nose used to wrinkle up. It looked like it was going to hide under his forehead. He hated the word English so much. And which is really odd, because his mother was English, which actually Scottish. I believe her last name was Elliott, her maiden name. However, Mr. Trudeau is very famous for his disdain, maybe that's a good word, of English people. And Chrétien himself, when he came to Ottawa as a member, he couldn't speak one word of English. He couldn't say hello. He does speak sort of English now, but it's not very good. It's a test to listen to. However, he's done very well with Quebec, and in my writing of Beauséjour, he had to come there just to get back to Beauséjour. And the man it's been a liberal riding like since Confederation, since more than 150 years. It's never been anything else. So the guy quit. Chrétien goes for to be elected. It's hands down. The Acadians, which are they're really the Huguenots, they speak a very old style of French from 1500 something. It's never changed. It's still it's like speaking Old English. They speak Old French. And Mr. Chrétien won the riding, no problem. I'll just give you an example, because I was there at this time in my home riding, and he was on television from Moncton, New Brunswick, thanking the people for electing him. I'm going to do it as he did it, as well as I can remember him doing it. He said, "I am proud to be your representative here in New Brunswick, thanking you." He got up and he walked out. He never returned to that riding. He went to Ottawa. He's the leader of the party, and now he can run for election. He can actually sit in Parliament because he has a seat. He was a leader without a seat. And he could not run in Quebec because they would not vote for him. They're used to all the shenanigans he'd get up to. Brian Mulroney, also from Quebec, rewarded his riding. When they voted for him and made him the party leader and the Prime Minister, he brought lots of jobs, good-paying jobs. Jean Chrétien did not do that for his riding. Not until his last year. Then he brought the jobs. So what do you think he built? He built a prison, a federal prison, federal jobs. He spent $2 billion. And everybody was very happy. They'll applaud. That's the way it works here with fascism. That's it. Thank you very much, everyone. I'm not going to do another Columbo right now, although I should, because Columbo would love it if I could. I'll think about it. Thanks.